I'm so excited to be here and to get to chat with Megan, who is not only one of my favorite writers, but one of my favorite people. I have been so lucky that I have known you for over a decade, I think.
I think it's been just about 10 years.
Yes. Yeah. And can count you not only as like a longtime critique partner, but a great friend. So I'm so excited to celebrate Malice House, your adult debut. I love it so much. Not only from like, there's so many elements to love it. I think that we were talking about this earlier. Like there's this gothic element of the setting, and there's these fascinating characters, and the plot is like twisty and surprising. So before I get to my questions, I would love if you could give like an overview for those who might not know of what Malice House is about.
Yeah, so it is my first book for an adult audience. So the main character is a woman in her mid-30s, and she is something of a struggling artist. And her father was a famous novelist, Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist. And so she's always lived in his shadow. And he passes away, and she goes to his home to clear out his belongings. And in the attic, she finds a secret manuscript that he has written that no one has ever heard of. And it's unlike his other works, his very like prestige literary works. This one is dark, macabre, sort of fairy tale-esque connection of stories. And that's more the kind of things that she likes to write or to illustrate. And so she gets the idea that she could get her art career going by illustrating this manuscript and sort of selling them to a publisher as like a packaged thing, leaning on her father's fame. And so she's in this small seaside town, trying to make this happen. She goes to the local bookseller, whose ex-husband was a former editor, trying to find a way to, publish and produce this book. And everyone in town starts to take a very unusual interest in the manuscript. There's the bookseller who's strange, the local librarian who's a bit strange. There's a barista / literary forger, a strange neighbor. And so, she's wondering why all these people are just so fascinated by this particular manuscript. And at the same time, some very dark, disturbing murders have been happening in town with sort of a monstrous quality. And she starts to, research this a little bit and wonder if perhaps the dark characters that she has been illustrated have actually stepped off the page into this town.
It is so good and creepy. I love it so much. So I feel like, I want to get into the characters because I think they're also fascinating, from the father and the daughter and all of these characters you mentioned around town, and also the people who might be coming off the page. But the first character that I always think of when I'm reading this story is the character of this setting, because Lundy Bay, the town itself, and the house in particular feel like such a character. It's so gothic in that way. And I was wondering if there was an inspiration point for either the town or the house, or how you went about creating it, and how you went about kind of giving these places a feel of, a real person or a real like setting that imbues everything that comes.
Yeah, I've always loved the haunted house genre of fiction and horror films as well. And that concept, the villain is perhaps a place that at a home, you think of your home as both your refuge, your haven, but then it can also be a bit claustrophobic and you can feel a bit trapped in it.
Yeah.
The town of Lundy Bay, which is on the Pacific Northwest coast, it's a sort of seaside vacation venue. It's inspired by the San Juan Islands, which is a place I went to with my sister years ago. And we were in Seattle. We took the ferry to the San Juan Islands, and we were taking the ferry out there, and like the mist parted and the rocky cliffs emerged, and then like right in the port town, there was a bookstore and a coffee shop that had fresh caramels. And I was like, I'm in, I'm sold. Like, this has to be a setting. This is just too perfect. So I always knew I wanted to set something there. It was just such an evocative, such a gothic setting. Yeah. And then the house itself, I came up with this idea many years ago for this book. but I wrote it during the pandemic. And my husband and I do live on this old farm property. And we did not know at the time that it is haunted. The neighbors informed us after we moved in. And then the first couple of weeks, we had some unusual incidents.
I feel like I need to hear a lot more about
Yes,
this.
yes. We had some unusual things happen. And I love my home. It's such a wonderful place for writing. It's very private. But during the pandemic, when I wrote this book, it was also extremely isolated, and it could get very claustrophobic. And at times I did feel very trapped there. And so writing a book about a haunted house in a house that is haunted and was very isolated and I was trapped in just really, really helped me get to that point of like capturing like that really intense mood.
I can see that entirely. I do feel like, especially writing during the pandemic, like the borders kind of pull even closer when you were writing. And so it's fascinating to me to think about like, writing a story like this during that time where she is like, her world is this house and what she creates in this house as well. It's so interesting.
Yeah. And the legacy of the house, the memories of the house, both for me in my house and in the story, it's not just her and her father's legacy, but the previous owner was a woman named Miss Alice, who was known in the town for being a really mean old lady. And that's how it got its name, Miss Alice. It was smashed together, Malice, Miss Alice, Malice House. So that's what the townspeople called it for years and years before her family even came to the book.
Fascinating.
Yeah, came to the house. Yeah.
Well, I'd love to talk more about these characters because I feel like they're just, I'm somebody like I always read a story and become invested in the characters first. And I feel like this is one where the characters just really create the story as well. And so Haven is this fascinating character because she's living in this legacy of her father's shadow. And I feel like, is this the first time you've written a character who's in the world of publishing or trying to be in the world of publishing as well? Or is
it is?
Yeah.
Yes.
I found that so interesting. Like, both as a book lover and a writer to read about this person who is getting a manuscript or trying to get a manuscript published and, meeting a community of librarians and is it the Ink Drinkers? I love that name as well. So could you talk about Haven's character and kind of this community of the writing world around her?
Yeah. Of all the characters I've ever written, Haven is the most like myself, minus all the horrible, disturbing stuff, mom and dad. But yeah, she's very embroiled in the publishing industry, both from her father, who was an author. She's a book illustrator. And then the book as well in town deals with the bookseller. There's a librarian. There's lots of publishing people. And I grew up in a bookstore, so I know the bookselling side very well. And I have a lot of friends who are librarians. And so I just kind of wanted to write a book about books and for people who love books, where the books can be a little bit nefarious. Some of the, usually when books deal with booksellers, it's like cozy mysteries and they're like sweet old ladies who like tea. And in this one, they might be murderers. And I just kind of liked suggesting that some of these book people are more kind of complex than that.
And I feel like going hand in hand with this, the structure of this book is fascinating because there is like a book within a book, which is one of my favorite things to read, because the book that she has found, just called
Bedtime Stories for Monsters,
amazing title, is basically found within the pages of Haven's story as well. So how did you go about kind of deciding on that structure? And did you write that story separately, or was that kind of as you were writing, you incorporated that to kind of introduce some of the characters?
Yeah. So in the book, she finds her father's manuscript, which is called Bedtime Stories for Monsters. And it's like these interconnected dark short stories. And I, he's supposed to be this amazing literary genius, like best writer of our time. So I wasn't going to write his book because I always do this to myself with every book where I have like some kind of genius. And then I'm like, oh, wait a minute, I don't know how to write that character. And so I only ever, in the first draft of this book, I only ever sort of referenced Bedtime Stories for Monsters. There were no excerpts or anything. And when I sold it to Disney, and my editor, the first thing he said was like, well, of course you're going to have to write bedtime stories for monsters. And I was like, I can't do that. That's from a perspective of a, 70 something arrogant male Pulitzer Prize winner. Like, that's not my writing style. But they convinced me to try it. And it was really interesting kind of writing experiment in a way. And now, so every chapter starts with an excerpt from one of those 8 stories from his. And as you read, you kind of see how they piece together and how they interweave with the main story as well. But I had to get inside the mind of somebody just very different from me, this older male writer, and think about, he's suffering from dementia. And when he wrote that manuscript. And so what would someone in that position, what would he produce? And I started to think, like, if he was suffering from dementia, he would probably be very fear-based. And what would someone of that position in life fear? And so every one of the demons in the story that he wrote is a different manifestation of a fear that I think someone in that position would feel. So there's like physical infirmity, there's possible losing prestige, losing his attractive charm to women, abuse by caretakers, caregivers, that sort of thing. So each one of the monsters represents sort of one of those fears. And it's set in like a 1950s dark spin on our world, which would have been like the world of his youth,
Yeah. Ooh, that's fascinating. I love that. And I feel like as you're reading, it almost is like it really does add to the tension as you're going, because you realize who these characters are and what they might be capable of before you might see that. So it's brilliant. I love the way that was done. I love like the different ways that, you can tell a story and reveal different parts of it. So speaking of like the different themes or things that her father might have been thinking of, I feel like I've been a longtime fan of your work forever. And I feel like there are themes that I can see in both your young adult and your adult work that kind of come back around. And one of them is like family legacy, creators and their creations, and the power of stories. I think they're very apparent in this book. And so I'm wondering, like, are these things you're thinking about consciously, or are they things that you just find yourself drawn to kind of explore in different ways in your stories?
I do think the question of theme is so interesting, and it takes me back to like high school English class, where they talk so much about what the author intended. And at the time I thought, I don't think the author put all this symbolism in it and meant it. And now I can verify that the author did not always mean to do it. I certainly, like, there are themes that I keep coming back to, and I've heard that's the same. I'd love to know what you think too. I've heard that's the same for so many authors, that there's just these sort of questions about humanity or whatever that you just kind of keep grappling with. And for me, a lot of it is talking about legacy and forging your own identity from the past, whether that's your family or your culture or whatever. My first book, The Madman's Daughter, was a retelling of The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. And it was from the mad scientist's daughter's perspective. And he, through science, was creating these monstrous figures. And in this book, it's like through art, they're creating these monstrous figures. So it is a very similar exploration of the theme. And I really like that particular theme, like the relationship between creator and creator in this book, just because as an artist myself, we grapple so often with what are we putting out there? What ideas are we putting out there? How's that going, viral in the world? Like, is it ideas that we're intentionally putting out or unintentionally? It could be like you put the seed of something out there and then it just spirals in a way you never intended. And so that is just making that idea actually manifested with real things that are stepping off the page. But there's such a concept of books and ideas being dangerous. And I just wanted to kind of explore like what that could actually mean.
That's really interesting, especially like, current events. Yeah, like I could totally see what that would mean. I do. I find like there are themes I also feel like you're drawn to them over and over again, but not even like realizing it sometimes. I had a few books ago, I had an interview and someone was like describe your book in 3 words. And I was like, the past returns. And I'm like, that describes literally everyone in my book. So I totally understand that too. So you kind of talked a little bit about, writing young adult and writing adult now. And I am fascinated by this too, because I do this as well. And was there something that led you to want to write your first book for adults, or do you approach them differently? That feels like this was the adult book versus your other ones that were young adult.
Yeah, I think so. I will say I was inspired by you.
Oh,
Because we first met, it was about, when did your first book come out? Was it 2012?
yeah.
And mine was 2013.
Yeah.
So
So it was like about a decade. Yeah.
And Megan wrote brilliant YAs for so long. And then we used to have this annual retreat that we would go to, and we would share a creepy room in a together in like a cabin in the woods.
Yes.
And
I feel like this is inspiration
year-
for so many of our books.
Yeah.
Like the creepy cabin in the woods. Yes.
one year there, and I remember we were sitting right over there at Malaprops. Do you remember? We were sitting
Yes,
at that
I do.
window seat.
I remember.
And you told me about an idea you had that went on to become All the Missing Girls, your first adult book. And it just was such a new stage for you. And I loved how you didn't let go of that idea. You pursued it so hard. You worked on it so hard for years. And just seeing like how much that idea meant to you and how you like stepped up as a writer, that really did encourage me a lot.
Thank you.
So, yeah. But so I love YA still.
Yeah.
I want to continue writing YA and middle grade as well.
Mhm.
But for this book, I've always felt like middle grade, whether it's sci-fi or dystopian or fantasy or contemporary, whatever, middle grade or young adult is very much about establishing your identity, figuring out like where, like who you're going to be, how you're going to fit into the world. Whereas adult is more about people who have maybe already found their place, at least in a temporary position. And they're more grappling with like decisions they've made in the past, mistakes they've made, dealing with the consequences of that. And so when I wrote this story, I knew I always wanted it to be about a woman who had made a lot of mistakes. And it was less about figuring out like how she's going to fit into the world and more about like her responsibilities in the world,
Yeah.
and that was just more of an adult
Yeah.
position to be coming from.
Yeah. No,
And that just led to the tone of just sort of picking up on slightly different themes. I mean, young adult readers are so sharp as well. They're totally capable of picking up on any kind of what we would consider mature themes. But just, I feel like the issues I'm dealing with this book are just more applicable to an adult reader.
right.
Someone, like myself, who has just gone through some of those challenges that you face in your 30s and 40s.
Yeah. No, I totally see that. Definitely. So, okay, I'm going to ask some writing questions.
Mhm.
And I feel like I know one of these answers, but I'm going to ask you anyway. I know because I'm jealous of her answer. Are you somebody who sees the story before you begin?
And we have been longtime critique partners, and we know how each other writes. And I am almost like clinical plotter.
Amazing.
Where
Amazing.
I have to know and think through exactly what happens. And Megan has this amazing ability. She'll send me the first half of a book, and it just feels like she has everything so tightly planned and plotted. And I say, oh my gosh, who did it? Like, who's the murderer in the end? And she says, I don't know.
Who do you think did it, Megan?
I'm like, how can you not know? Okay, wait, what was the question? Just about
Yeah, like what do you know at the start of your story, and
yes.
how do you go about kind of crafting?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
really am a meticulous
Yeah.
plotter. And for me, in order to lay the clues early, I have to know where the story's going. And
Okay.
I might not always know like exactly what's going to happen in the end, but I sort of know what I want the character to have discovered or learned or changed, how they will have changed. But that said, often I have that in mind, and then I start writing it, and by the time I reach that point, it's become a totally different book.
Right.
And that's fine, but I think that for me, I have to have that sort of guiding star, or else I just meander too much and I go off on the rails too much.
I understand.
And and that's just how I kind of keep to the path. Yeah.
Okay. So you have your idea of where a story's going to end, but you kind of like give yourself the flexibility of how you're going to get there if things change.
Yes.
Okay.
And I'll say this book did change quite a bit. There's the paranormal aspect to the book, and kind of Stephen King-esque, where it's not like it's so in your face. You know, you don't really see the monster like immediately. It's sort of hovering in the background, which is my favorite kind of thing to read.
Yeah.
But there are paranormal things happening, and again, I'm sorry. And so when I first wrote the first draft of the book, those were a lot stronger. Like in the second half of the book, it was like very hardcore paranormal. And I kind of had in my gut that I did want to pull back a little bit and keep it more focused on the humanity of the characters and the themes, and less about, you know, some of the more sensational things happening. And my agent agreed. And so I threw out the whole second half and rewrote it in a totally different way.
That's such a leap of faith to do too, to be like,
yeah,
I'm going to see where this goes in a second try.
Yeah, it is. It's hard. It's really hard. Like in the moment when you have invested so much time up front, like sometimes months or years in writing it, and you decide to just really literally throw all that out and start afresh. But I really, really know it was the right choice. And this is the book that I really wanted it to be. And I'm so happy with the balance that I struck of having some of those paranormal aspects with some of the horrors of the real world.
Yeah.
It's like internal and external demons.
Definitely.
Mixed together.
I feel like you can see both of those arcs, like for the character and the world, and like that. And one other thing I wanted to talk about with characters is this idea of unreliability in characters in general. And one thing I'm fascinated about is the different ways that, like, I feel like, you know, unreliable narrators get this sense of like, well, you know, that we pulled a trick, but it's really like, I think there's so much really, really interesting things about like what a character knows and what they discover along the way. And so much of the journey of a book is a character discovering, you know, even though it's not a young adult book, I think there's so much discovery in adult books still in that character arc along the way. And so much is what you discover about your family and what you're capable of. And I think you just do such a beautiful job of her character as someone I'm just really excited to follow. And on that note, I know there's going to be a sequel. Is that?
Yes.
So can you tell us a little about what we can expect without giving spoilers for the first book?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So this was acquired by Disney. It's the first book that they're putting out under a new imprint. They reorganized all of their books and all of their original fiction. That's not like the Disney princess stuff. They publish original fiction like this as well. And this is the first book that came out from that new division, which has been really exciting. And they acquired it as a series called the Malice Compendium. And so yeah, the next book comes out next year. I am editing it right now. And it's called Midnight Showing. And where this book very much looks into the publishing industry and the world of books. This one is about the world of movies and old Hollywood, film noir, that kind of also very creepy industry. And it takes place in LA and deals with Hitchcockian kind of Lovecraftian maybe monsters that have potentially emerged from these movies in a sort of urban legend way. And that book was so fun to write because I don't know a lot about the film industry. Some of my books have been optioned for film, and so I have spoken to different producers and potential directors, and I sort of have picked up a little bit on the very unique Hollywood lingo. But I've never been to LA or anything. And so, other than watching like Real Housewives and $1 Million Listing, it just required so much more research, which I really enjoyed. And in this book, in Malice House, the main character, her side job that she does to pay the bills is she recaps these very dark horror movies that people are too scared to watch, which is me. This is me. I have this thing where I am obsessed with horror movie plots, but I can't watch the movies.
So you read the plots?
Yeah, so I just read the plots. So I'm like, I have to know what happens. What's so scary about it? But I can't actually watch it. And so she's the one who's recapping all of these really disturbing movies So she already has this like connection with Hollywood, and she has a connection with some underground producers. And so they feature into the second book as well. So she has some kind of insider connections with that world.
I love that. And this has kind of made me ask another question about, so, there's research into the film world. Was there any other research that kind of played into either this book or the new book that you're working on?
I did look at a lot of other books within books to see how they handled it, and to see how, because you really can't just have, or you wouldn't want to just have like random excerpts that don't tie into the main story. And so I was very interested to see how other authors had struck that balance and created this book within a book where you're foreshadowing maybe things that will happen in the main storyline, but not giving away too much information. There's some fantastic other books that do this. Riley Sager's Home Before Dark is brilliant if you love haunted house books. Shay Earnshaw's A History of Wild Places is about a children's book illustrator or author who goes missing. There's one of my favorite books as a teen was The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafron. Just so good about like a book within a book kind of thing. So that was really great to take that excuse to go back and reread a lot of these books, to sort of see how other authors had struck that balance. Yeah, I mean, I think like the publishing, some of the feedback I got from my editor was it goes a little too hard into the publishing world, and that people might not like all the minutia. So, I pulled back on that a little bit because I'm pretty familiar with that world.
Right.
But yeah, other than just the usual things I have no knowledge of, which are detective practices, firearms, house fires. Those were what I reached out to some expert friends for information on.
And monsters.
Yes.
That's awesome. Well, I would love to turn this over for any audience questions. If you have anything you'd love to hear about from Megan about Malice House and the writing.
Or Megan.
Yes.
I love Pinchy. He is my favorite creation since Balthazar in the Madman's Daughter series. And is there any chance that we might get to see Pinchy again in a future tale?
Okay, so the question was about one of the monsters in the book, Pinchy, whose story, oh gosh, I can't think of the name of his story right now. Oh, I wish I could remember, but
literally the monster under the bed at one point.
Yeah, he's sort of the monster under the bed.
Yeah.
He's this crustacean, this human-sized, pale, fleshy crustacean who lives under people's beds. And when you put your foot down, he's sort of this, he becomes almost an endearing character in the book in a way. He at times, some of the monsters help each other in different ways. And so they're not all totally evil in a sense. And Pinchy is sort of the pet of one of the monsters who's like his name is the Harbinger, and he's human looking, and he's sort of the minder of all the other monsters, and Pinchy is sort of his pet who he looks out for as Pinchy is off murdering everybody. Well, I won't give away what happens if Pinchy lives or dies in the first book, so I can't tell you that, but I did send my editor a custom Pinchy t-shirt. So.
How did you come up with all of these different characters? Was it just like straight from your imagination?
Yeah, it's just from my imagination. I really love the balance of so I knew I wanted to have 8 stories, 8 monsters, and so just really trying to have some of them be human looking. Right. There's a witch. There's the Harbinger. There's one of the creatures looks human, but whatever he whispers, you have to do, so he can compel you to do anything. And then some of them are actual monsters like Pinchy, and there's a hellhound and some creatures like that, and some evil mermaids. And so I just like kind of having that mix and trying to find the right mix and pulling off of classic movie lore and horror novel lore as well.
Were you a big horror reader growing up? Too?
Only the synopses. No, a little bit. Yeah. Like, so the bookstore I grew up in, my parents' bookstore, had its like classic section on one shelving unit, you know, and it was all like things I should be reading. And then on the other side was all the Christopher Pike and R.L. Stein, which I was actually reading, you know, so I'd go back there and pretend to read, you know, Bronte and then actually read all the dark stuff. Yeah, a little bit. And I for sure loved Shirley Jackson, Stephen King. But a lot of it really does come from just like being so fascinated by what scares people.
Yes.
And just wanting to lean into that. Yeah.
There have been shows that everyone has loved and I've been so desperate to watch and I can't make it through the first episode because I am a giant chicken. And I have had to ask, like, I had one of my cousins give me the entire synopsis of The Haunting of Hill House show. Like they went through every episode and they were like, you can watch it again. I'm like, okay, now I know. And still I saw the first episode and I was like, it's too scary for me.
Oh yeah.
But I so want to be able to watch it. And I feel like with reading, I can read it because I can kind of pace it out.
Yeah, that's true.
A little more.
That's true. Yeah.
More of a reader than a watcher of the scary thing.
Well, I recommend the synopses, themoviespoiler.com. Excellent.
I would do.
We've got a question from Apple audience from Jenny Liu, who's another local author. And Jenny is asking how the jump from YA to middle grade to adult has been. And were there any notable differences in working with the editors?
Oh, interesting. So the question was about moving from middle grade to YA to adult and working with editors, and you will have some interesting things to say as well. I would say in my experience, like from the creative standpoint, I started with YA, and YA for me was very much like my heart, like a lot of romance and a lot of dreaminess that was me when I was 16. I was like a huge daydreamer kind of thing. So my YAs capture that. And then my middle grade is like me when I was, 8. And just sort of like, that's sort of like my spirit, like my soul is that just like pure secret garden, classic literature, feeling the like initial magic of the world sort of self.
Yeah.
And then adult fiction is more like my head, the intellect, like tapping into questions more of like, just those more mature questions about morality and identity and that kind of thing. And so I feel like creatively, like I honestly love writing for all 3 ages equally. And I hope I can continue to balance that out. I just really love tapping into those different like iterations of who I was as a person.
Yeah.
As far as the writing, I have noticed a difference, like working with an editor for adult fiction. It's a bit more hands-off. I don't know if this is, just this one editor I've worked with or kind of experience across the board, but the YA felt much more like the editors I worked with really were interested in analyzing the book and like, looking at each character and each character's motivation and that kind of thing. Whereas the adult editors are much more like, go off and do your thing, and I really actually appreciate that a lot. I like that sort of trust that I have gotten as an adult author.
Yeah, I see the same. And in terms of writing, I think it's really interesting to hear like, at different times of your life, you can kind of connect with that different part of yourself and your story. And I don't think I approach them differently when I'm writing them. I feel like it's all about the perspective, but the perspective is so different. And I feel like there's this really strong immediacy in a young adult perspective where you're figuring yourself out for the first time, figuring out your place in the world. And not that changes necessarily in like the adult books where like, yes, you can still be figuring out your place in the world, but I feel like there's this element of hindsight to it where you're maybe like in the young adult space, because I write first person like you, and like you're filtering everything through like experiencing something for the first time. And then when I write adult, I feel like I'm filtering it through like these years of lived experience and choices and decisions, like you were saying, that have brought you to this moment, that have maybe changed your perspective of things. And then that gives it a different perspective when you're writing. But I don't set out to write them differently, but I do feel like they take a different tone because of the perspective.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. I love the way you put that. Yeah.
Can you talk about a character or a plot or some bit of research that you had to cut that you really liked?
Ooh. That's a great question. The question was, can you tell us about either research or character or plot point that you had to cut?
Well, I had to cut half the book. So yes, there was a lot. Yeah, I had in the first draft, I had a very supernatural plot line where all of the characters who had come out of this manuscript, they're from a world called Malice. And they had a very specific goal, and that they were all working together towards. It was very Lovecraftian. And it was just I would say a more YA plot line. And so I cut that. I cut the main character. He was called the main monster, who's called the Salem Dreamer, which I still love that name. We'll reuse it. But yeah, so I did do away with that character and do away with that goal, and I actually really, really am happy with that decision, because it means that the monsters that emerge into our world are a bit lost. Like they're still grappling with their roles from the book that they were in, but they're in a new world. And I like that. I feel like it's more realistic, as far as it could be realistic, to what would happen. And I like the empathy that it gives to these monsters, that they are a bit lost. They don't really know what their role is now. Some of them are just want to kill everybody. And so they try to do that in our world, but then others of them are a lot more complex and have like more complex motivations and are changing. They change quite rapidly and they adapt very rapidly. And so they are learning how to fit into this world in sometimes very frighteningly fast ways.
Of all the different monsters that you created for the book, which one scares you the most?
Ooh, okay. Which monster scares me the most? I know my editor and a lot of readers find Uncle Arnold the scariest, who is the old man. He's an encyclopedia salesman, and he's quite normal look, overlookable. And at some point, he has this accident that gives him the ability to control people with his voice, and he really takes very sinister advantage of that, especially like with women. And that is terrifying for sure. But I have this other character called the Witch of Wint, who is,
I was gonna say.
and she is a witch, a woman who has been really abused by men and people in power. And at first she would take revenge on them, and she can sort of create different potions out of body parts. And so she really enjoys getting revenge in that way on several people who have wronged her. And in a way that's very understandable. And she's almost like a vigilante hero, but then she takes it to this like extreme that is just very frightening and very unrelatable, and very monstrous. And I find her just like complete lack of remorse, and that way that she almost could be a character that you love and root for, but she's really not. She really is a truly evil character. I really like that about her, and it does scare me. Yeah.
There's something in like horror and thrillers when you take an idea and then push it to an extreme, and then like that's something you explore. You take like something you can relate to and and then push it. And
yeah. And the reader's like, oh, wait a minute.
So Megan, Miranda, can you tell the folks here at home a little bit more about The Last Vanish, and also maybe what you have coming up next as well?
Can, yes. So The Last to Vanish is about a small mountain town in North Carolina, probably not too far from here, but not here, I promise, with a very notorious history. So over the last 25 years, 7 visitors have gone missing without a trace. Most recently, a journalist who was investigating a string of disappearances. And at this point, as the local sheriff says, this is like really bad optics. And it now has the designation as the most dangerous town of North Carolina. But this is not a deterrent for the people who come to visit. If anything, it's a draw because it makes them think that they can be the one to uncover it. So I was really interested in this idea. Like, I'm so drawn to place like you, of like a place with a notorious history. And my kids had taken class trips to Charleston and would take these ghost tours. And they'd come home and be like, they'd tell me about these historical ghost tours. And it made me think like, what about a place where the history is not that far in the past? And what if that history was still happening? And that was sort of like where this town came from to begin with. I love like you, like a setting, like a character. And I have my next book. My editor always jokes that I always set a book either like in the woods or near the water. My next book's going to the water, set in the Outer Banks, and it comes out in the spring, and there'll be more information very soon on that one. So, but yeah, I'm excited. I love I feel like we're very similar in the time, like that we love like these settings that are just very atmospheric and feel like a character and like what can happen.
I think the mood of a book, which plays so much into setting, is one like hallmark of both of our stories. And one thing I think that we both love as readers as well. For me, a book, I will read it and I will forget what happened in the plot. I'll even forget about the characters, but I just remember how it made me feel. And that's so much about the mood and it ties into the setting. And
Another question from the audience from Bonnie Kissler, who's another writer, and says, is it verboten to ask about the ghost writing? But if you can talk about it.
Oh, ghostwriting. Okay. Well, it is verboten actually. only because I signed some NDAs. But yeah, I this year or this past year wrote a novelization of a well-known movie that will be coming out next year. So I am very excited about that, but it hasn't been announced yet. So
And for anybody at home who, we know you can't speak in specifics, but for anybody who like isn't familiar with ghostwriting in general, if there's anything that you can maybe share about how you came to that, or how that experience goes, because as a bookseller, I didn't really realize how often it happened, I guess, until
Yeah, well, so this project is for Disney, which is the same publisher as this one, but it is a Disney property that you will all know and hopefully love, like I do. My agent just came to me and said they're looking for someone to do this, and they think that you've got the right voice for it. I think it like plays into some of the Gothic horror, touching on things that I've written before. So I was so stoked to have the opportunity to do it. And I'll say writing a novelization is so different from writing original fiction, or even writing, I know some people like Alan Gratz and Beth Revis, who are in the audience, have written Marvel and Star Wars things, but you're still creating the story, and you're still creating even some of the characters and things. Novelization, I don't create anything. It's just almost this amazing experience of taking a story someone else has written and just putting it into a different medium. And so it involved watching this particular film 100 times, frame by frame, and just creating it in prose and shaping the story world in prose and having the dialogue match up exactly, because this movie has a lot of fans, hardcore fans. And so I really wanted to, keep the core things that people love about the movie. So I actually really, really loved it, just because I wasn't creating it myself. And I found it a fascinating experience to go through. And I did try to add a few little like extra scenes that I thought readers would like, and they all got cut. Because the creator of this movie is, obviously very particular. And I think the readers, the fans of the movie, will really want it to be just super, super authentic to the original. So, yeah.
there might be something you need to repeat there, because downtown Asheville.
Oh, okay.
That's the last thing you said, because someone that's sort of, I'm gonna say it on TV, all obnoxiously revving their engine down the street. So in case anybody else missed what you just said, thank you.
Yes. So I was just saying that, writing this novelization, I just found to be such a refreshing project where it wasn't my story world to create, and it took a lot of the pressure off in a sense. And it just let me focus purely on the prose writing rather than the world building. because that was already done by somebody else. And that, that world builder who did the original one is very particular to it. And the fans of this franchise are very particular. And so even though I tried to create some like behind the scenes stories and little Easter eggs and put in, those all got cut, understandably, because this really is just like a true novelization of what happens in the movie. Okay. Oh, okay.
Do you think that reading the synopses of some of like the horror movies and stuff helped you with that?
Oh, for sure. Yes, for sure. Especially I will say with the second book, because the sequel to this is all about movies, and it's about a 1950s era production company that was cursed and produced all these kind of Hitchcockian movies. And so all of those movies are not directly inspired by any old horror movie, but kind of play on that a little bit. And so I read, and there's even some callbacks to some more like cheesy 80s movies as well. And so I read so many horror synopses, just to sort of see how they were structured, how they were different from novels and fiction, which is what I'm used to. They're very different, and so much more visual and all of that. And so, yeah, I definitely leaned on that a lot. And you'll find all the usual horror movie tropes. There's a possessed doll, there's
it's the creepiest thing
yeah.
I can imagine.
Yeah. So, all that kind of stuff is in the second book, and then is mentioned as well in some of the movies that she has recapped.
This one's just for me. How did you approach writing scenes that it sounds like if they were filmed, you wouldn't be able to watch?
Ooh, that's a great question.
That is a good question. I have always been able to draw the line personally between fact and fiction. So most things that are fiction, especially reading, it can be pretty grisly. I can kind of handle it. But true crime, I really have a hard time with. If I know it's actually happened, like the Jeffrey Dahmer Netflix show, it's so difficult for me to handle knowing that it really happened. But fiction, I'm like, sure, I can take it. But yeah, with movies, it's a little bit different. I actually just genuinely get scared by those. Even though I know it's fiction, it's not like I'm so worried. Can't take the gruesomeness or anything. It's just like I just really get scared by it. But I think when I'm the one crafting the scary parts, it's so engineered that sometimes I do scare myself, but I have the benefit of time, and I have the benefit of being the puppet master, and so when you see behind the curtain, it's not always as scary as it looks from the outside.
You're controlling it.
Yeah.
And how about you? Because you're writing some pretty intense stuff as well. Is there a difference between, because you mentioned earlier not being able to watch Hill House, for instance.
Yes, I do. I think it's the same. I think like I was always someone who was drawn to the darker fiction, really interested in those stories of like morality and like mortality, but like I was also a kid who was afraid of everything. And so I was like, why am I drawn to this all the time? But I think I see it as a character first, and like your stories, when you're writing character first, it's like your character is going to make your way through something. And that's the way I approach it. Like, these are the things that the character is going to face, but I see the arc that they're coming through the other side. And I think there is this element of control when you're the one behind, like you're the puppet master, you're seeing the pieces in place. I will say the research scares me more than the writing, honestly. When I'm kind of deep in like researching certain topics for a book, that can be very visceral, I think, in a way that writing fiction is not, because you're saying like it's the
true stuff. Yeah.
Right. That's where I have a harder time. And I don't know, like for you, I find that I have to compartmentalize my writing. Like I have a place I write and a time I write, and I kind of close that door at the end of the day and kind of re-enter my life with like my children. And like, I'm not thinking about those things. Do you do that as well? Or do you kind of like, what's your writing process?
I do. Yeah. I have a home office that I, have the door that I shut and everything. But I have a 2 and a 4-year-old at home, and you've got to compartmentalize because the things that they're interested in are not the same things that I'm interested in. And Yeah, so it's just almost like living different lives,
Mhm.
you know, and I'll switch between doing this dark research like we talked about, getting deep into these stories, and then going and watching Blippi for 2 hours, which could be dark too. I mean,
Yeah.
it depends on who you're asking. Yes.
So this is for both of you. Is there in the plotting and the thinking about both of these books, was there a scene that you had in mind early on that you built the story around, like an anchor for you that you were always working toward, or maybe that started things off, and that you used as the heart of the story, and then did it end up in the final draft?
Oh, that's a great one.
Mine did for Malice House. Yeah, it started with the scene of Pinchy under the bed, and the main character throughout the book has been wondering what's going on. There's strange things happening, and they seem like unusual and monstrous, but she, obviously can't bring herself to believe that. And then there's a scene where she gets out of bed and is attacked by Pinchy, and it's impossible to deny what's happening. And it's that flip from, oh, okay, is the monster real or not? Yes, it is.
Mhm.
And I just love that. And it happens, not right away, but fairly early on in the book. And I just really like not trying, like so many horror movies hold that until the very end, like, is the monster real or not? And I always wanted this book to be pretty early on, like, yes, that the monster is real and she's attacked. And I just liked, thinking about what would happen if I actually went through something like that, where I was faced with some paranormal element that was unexplainable. How would I react to it? And I really enjoyed writing that scene, and it did make it in. So yeah.
So, I was thinking about that as Megan was talking, because I can't think of a specific scene for this one. For Such a Quiet Place, which is my prior book, there were 4 sentences that I came up with, like, in the first third of the book, that I was like, this is what I'm working towards. And it wasn't necessarily a scene, but it was a realization. And those 4 sentences made it into the story. And there's something that people point out sometimes. And so I'm very grateful, we made it to that point. It varies for a book, and I'm not as much of a plotter as Megan. And so for me, it's sometimes either a structural thing that I'll see, or a character place that I want them to be. And for this book, it was not character or plot, but the book is structured on, it's in 5 parts, and it's based on missing notices. And I knew where I wanted to get in the last part. And so that was helpful to as a guidepost of and it did make it in that. It was different than what I thought it would be, but it was the same intention of what that part would be, if that makes sense. Yeah.
We've both been in publishing for a long time, and it seems like over the last decade, a lot has changed with things like book talk and publishers merging and trends coming and going. So what is it like to work in an industry that fluctuates and changes so much?
It's a great question.
I think the core is that you got to keep telling yourself that people are always going to want stories. And so we as storytellers will always have a job, but the form might look different. Whether, we both wrote for the YA market when the YA market was really big, and then that bubble kind of burst. And some people are still going strong, but then it has changed a lot. And so many authors have had to adapt and try out different things. But we're still telling stories, and whether I write for adults or teenagers, it doesn't matter to me. I love them equally. And so you do have to be able to shift. I'm grateful that I feel like I've got enough ideas, that can shift, but it's very helpful to have an agent to help you navigate that, because it is amazing how quickly the industry changes. Like you said, and especially the whole marketing side, that's a whole nother beast with book talk. And when we started, it was all blog tours, and then Instagram tours, and now book talk. And so I personally really find the marketing stuff fascinating. I love staying on top of that. But there's a lot of authors who don't, and just leave it up to the publisher. And at that point, you've got to just trust that they know what they're doing, and trust that there's nothing you can really do about it at that point. All you're in control of is the story itself.
that's, so what Megan said at the end is like kind of the mantra I've told myself, I think for 10 years is like, I can control the words on the page. And that's like, for me, the thing that's helpful is to focus on the things I can control. And to trust that like the stories will have a place and find a market and find an audience. And there is so much that changes, and kind of being flexible of like, you know, if you have different ideas, like sometimes this is the one that's right for this time, and this is one that takes a back seat until maybe a later time, and being able to have that flexibility. But I think something that's just been like a constant for me is to focus on the things I can control, and that's like the story I'm telling, because everything else is a little bit out of control. Yes.
I'm wondering for both of y'all, when you're creating dark material, do you think that folks confuse your storytelling with who you really are? Or is that really who you are?
Do you get that comment a lot? People be like, oh, I was expecting you to be like a little scarier in person based on like the books
Yeah.
that I write. Yeah.
I think we're both quite
Yeah.
normal in person.
Yeah.
And like,
I think
dare I
that,
say nice. Yeah. Like we're sweet people, you know? Yeah. Yeah. I think so too. And I do get that. I get that from my mom a lot.
Yeah.
And I think that like, to me, it doesn't feel like a mismatch at all. It's just, everybody has a different spectrum of their personality. And I'm very comfortable with that. And so for me, it doesn't feel strange to be, you know, watching Blippi with my kids and then go write about horror stuff. Yeah, I don't know. I would just say that maybe I have a little bit of a wider spectrum as far as like, I really like the bright things in life, and then the dark things in life I'm open to too, you know? What would you say?
No, I completely agree. I think there are like things that I feel like writing is like you're like, I feel like I'm interested in exploring something, and there's like a question. Like I think of a theme as like a question to explore a lot of the times, and you explore it from like many different angles, and there's not necessarily an answer, but you're kind of like diving back into these things like, let's explore like human nature and like how do like I'm fascinated with like, I love book clubs because you can say this is what I would do in a situation, but then in these stories you're like, okay, but what if it's your parent or your daughter or your sibling or your best friend, and like how do all those, like how does that shift people's morality? And that's what I love exploring like in fiction and in the shows I watch and the books I read, and I love the darker side of things. And yes, then I have like, I started writing when my kids are 1 and 3 and they are teenagers now, and like this is not the things we talk about usually on like a daily basis. I mean, we do watch Stranger Things together, like we watch dark things, but I feel like there's just room for everything. There's room for all the sides of interest and personality.
And as you're saying that, it makes me think that it's sometimes, it feels less about like me as a person and what I like and don't like. And I feel almost more as a writer, just personally, I feel almost like a tool to talk about the world. And so it's less that like, I love dark things. It's more that like, I just want to put on paper the world for people to understand. And in the world, there's really, really dark things. There's also really good things too, you know? And so people often think like, wow, you must be really, really fascinated by this stuff. And I'm like, kind of, but for me, it's more like, I'm just looking at the wider culture and wider world and trying to translate that for people.
It's a really good way of putting it. Yeah, I like that. What she said.
Could you both read the first 9 of your books?
Ooh.
Oh, the first line.
Why don't you go first?
Okay, well, I might get my glasses. Hold on.
I can read it for you if you would like.
Okay, I feel like mine is like very stereotypical, like here we go thriller. He arrived at night in the middle of a downpour, the type of conditions more suitable for a disappearance.
All right, I'm cheating. Mine has 2. The first one is from the story within the story. One step away from our world lies another, a land of violent fantasies, of sharp-toothed delights. From the introduction to Bedtime Stories for Monsters. And then, I never meant to find the manuscript, but maybe it meant to find me.
That's the perfect spot to end.
I think so, yes.